Reese, welcome. Chairperson and Chief Executive Officer. And of course, she is accompanied by Mr. Scott Hutton and Mr. Scott Shortland. Welcome. In just a moment here, I'll give the floor to you, and I believe it is up to the three of you to determine how you wish to split your time. You have 10 minutes for opening remarks. You can begin.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Thank you for having us here with you today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe people. As mentioned, I am joined by the Scots today. So Scott Shortliff is over here, and he is our head of broadcasting, and Scott Hutton, to my right, is head of consumers, analytics, and strategy. We are very pleased to be here to update the committee on the implementation of the Online Streaming Act. Before getting into committee members' questions, perhaps I could share a brief overview of the CRTC, some of the work that we are doing, and give some of the detail on our progress. So starting with the quick overview of the CRTC. As you know, the CRTC is an independent quasi-judicial tribunal that regulates the communications sector in the public interest. We hold public consultations on telecommunications and broadcasting matters, and we make decisions based on the public record. The Commission consists of 9 members. There's a chairperson, a vice chair for broadcasting, a vice chair for telecommunications, and 6 regional members who are located across the country. The Commission is supported by a team of expert staff who help us make informed decisions. And we are moving quickly to make those decisions because we know that Canadians and businesses need certainty. At the same time, we are consulting broadly before making these major decisions. We are listening to diverse voices to better understand how changes in the communications landscape affect Canada's broadcasting system. Je sais que nous sommes ici pour parler de la radio.
I know that we're here to talk about broadcasting, but let me just briefly touch on some of our other major lines of work, namely promoting competition and affordability in telecommunications and empowering consumers. In our meetings with Canadians across the country, we have heard how critical high-quality internet and telephone services are for employment, healthcare, education, safety, connecting with loved ones, and so much more. We have also heard what happens when there is a lack of meaningful connectivity, and those stories are troubling. To address this, we have helped provide Canadians with more choice for internet and cell phone services by allowing competitors to sell plans using the networks of large telecommunications companies. And we are seeing positive movement in the market. For example, according to Statistics Canada, prices for telephone services decreased by 16.7% between 2023 and 2024. At the same time, we want to ensure that we have a healthy and innovative industry, so we have put measures in place to make sure companies keep investing in high-quality networks. Ensuring that Canadians have access to high-quality networks and choice is one part of the equation. The other part is making sure that Canadians can easily find those choices, switch to plans that best meet their needs, and not be surprised by higher bills. Last year, the CRTC launched a comprehensive Consumer Protections Action Plan to address these issues. This is a crucial area of our work that will continue to be a focus for the CRTC.
Work on the telecommunications side, but I know that this committee wants to focus on broadcasting. As you know, Parliament gave the CRTC a major task when it entrusted us with implementing the Online Streaming Act. The Act requires us to modernize Canada's broadcasting framework and ensure that online streaming services make meaningful contributions to Canadian and Indigenous content. Modernizing the decades-old regulatory framework is no small task. The changes that are required are substantial and they're complex. Given this responsibility, we responded within days of the passage of the bill by launching a regulatory plan to facilitate participation and to increase transparency. And we have been making progress on that plan. We have launched 15 public consultations and held 4 public hearings. On just those 4 public hearings, we've received over 1,000 written interventions and heard oral presentations from over 300 interested parties. We know that following these public proceedings, people are very interested to see our decisions. We have issued 7 decisions so far that start to set out the foundation of the future broadcasting framework, and other major decisions are coming very soon. One of the first key decisions was on base contributions, which helped bring online streaming services into the broadcasting system. That decision was based on over 360 written submissions and over 120 presentations that we heard during a public hearing that lasted 3 weeks. Based on the evidence provided, the CRTC determined that online streaming services should make initial contributions to the broadcasting system and that those contributions should be directed to areas of immediate need. That includes local news on radio and television, French language content, and Indigenous content. That decision will result in an estimated $200 million annually flowing into the broadcasting system. And that decision was just the beginning. Just over the summer, we issued 2 additional decisions to support local news on radio and television, particularly in smaller markets where there are fewer options. We know how important news is. We hear this from Canadians across the country, and we're sure that committee members do as well. While issuing those decisions in June and August, we have also been busy holding public hearings. La première audience en mai a duré.
The first hearing in May was 3 weeks long. It focused on the definition of Canadian content for television and streaming. We heard a wide range of views on how the system can better support and promote Canadian stories, and on what investments are required to encourage a variety of productions and business models, broadcast and distribution models. We also heard about tools needed to support certain types of Canadian programming. We considered complex issues like the impact of artificial intelligence and the role of intellectual property in the broadcasting sector. The second major hearing, in June, explored the dynamics between the different types of players in the Canadian broadcasting system. What we heard will help us create a sustainable model for the delivery and discoverability of diverse Canadian and Indigenous content. The results of this hearing will help ensure equitable access to the broadcasting system and promote a fair and competitive marketplace, supported by an updated dispute resolution framework. Finally, the third hearing, which wrapped up earlier this week, focused on radio and audio streaming services. We heard a variety of views on how to define Canadian content for music. We also considered the major changes in the industry and the impact of these on streaming services.
Are key to ensuring a modern and sustainable broadcasting system for Canada. The decisions flowing from these consultations and others will be issued in the coming weeks and months. In fact, within days, you will see a decision that helps address the administrative burden on radio stations, so stay tuned. To wrap up, we are doing work on multiple fronts. I touched on a few of those fronts, but the list is long. As we continue to prioritize the implementation of the legislation that has been entrusted to us by Parliament, we are also taking action in other areas like the Online News Act, service outages, the Broadband Fund, and making it easier for people to participate in CRTC proceedings. Again, we're moving quickly because we know that Canadians and businesses need certainty, and at the same time, we are consulting broadly. As a quasi-judicial tribunal, we know that better decisions are made when we listen to individuals, when we listen to businesses, and we listen to organizations that bring diverse perspectives to the conversation. We're always listening to what Canadians need. We know that committee members are as well, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Un rappel au règlement, Madame la Présidente, avant de continuer.
A matter of order. I'm not quite sure why, but there is a kind of unusual sound on the headphones. I didn't want to interrupt our witness, but it was the same thing when you were speaking at the outset, Madam Chair. I just want to ensure that we're very vigilant. I wouldn't like to see any sort of auditory accident or unusual event that would be problematic. I would like us to check. It's really like a slightly screeching sound, and this could be damaging to all those who have headphones on. I think it might be the volume in the room, because right over here, I just reduced the volume slightly.
Something I've experienced before. It's never fun. So if we turn it down in the room, it will probably happen less. I think that's what's going on.
Okay, we're just, sorry.
Sorry, I don't mean to.
We're just going to suspend just for one moment and try to resolve this before we continue. So just give us one moment. Thank you, colleagues. At this point in time, I will give the floor to Mr. Waugh. Mr. Waugh, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome again, Ms. Treaties and the two Scots. Coming up to 3 years as the CEO of CRTCs, you mentioned online streaming services should make initial contributions to the broadcasting system. Is that 200 million? Should make? Tells me we're not sure. On your speech here, you say should make initial contributions. Should tells me it's up in the air. Is that true?
Perhaps I'll answer, sir. So the decision was that they have to contribute 5% of their annual revenues. We estimated that it is roughly 200 million. Of course, it will change from year to year. When we made that decision, we asked that the amounts be paid out by the end of the broadcast year, which would have been the end of August this year. The streaming companies did seek a stay in court, which they have perfect right to do. The court granted it. We are waiting for the Federal Court of Appeal to rule on the issues they've raised. So until that decision is made, the money is not actually yet flown into the system completely, so we cannot give a complete account of whether it is 200 million, a bit more or a bit less, although we will be doing that once that issue is resolved.
Thank you, Scott. So it just seems to me more money you hand out, the worse the local news is in this country. I don't have to tell you what happened in Lloydminster and Medicine Hat this year. They lost television stations that were there for 60 and 70 years. And, you know, it was great. Ms. Atreides, you're saying, oh, the CRTC cares about local news. Tell that to the laid-off employees. Tell that to Lloydminster and Medicine Hat people that have followed CHAT, CKSA for years because they just went dark overnight. Stingray and, along with them, Pattison just pulled the plug, just came in and said, we're done. We can't make it go anymore. So I just gave you two examples. And those are great examples because it just happened this spring. So what do you say to those people when you say you want to help local news? And I just gave you an example of probably 50 people laid out and communities now not being served by independent media. They're being served by the private broadcaster. CBC walked in. So there is an issue that I have when you have the public broadcaster without, let's face it, millions of dollars advantage. They walk into these markets because these other markets have shut down. Your thoughts on those two, because I'm getting inundated with emails.
So we are equally concerned about local news. Speaking with Canadians, and again, I'm sure that committee members hear about this often, we hear about the importance of local news. We hear about on the ground when there's wildfires, other disasters. Yep. People are learning about what's happening on the corner of their street and when they actually need to evacuate from local news, from radio. And so we've heard this from people. So we are concerned about the state of local news. As mentioned, in the base contribution decision, we decided that one area of immediate need was news. And so that is why we directed a certain portion of that initial base contribution to news. We can get into some of the, we've issued decisions recently for TV as well as for radio for news in June and August, and we can talk a little bit about the support that we're bringing there.
Okay, so local news, CRTC is all about local news. Why then is the CTV network showing American football all day Sunday and all night Monday? So we don't get any local news out west, Saskatoon on, because I pay for TSN subscription. But TSN is also owned by Bell Media, as you know, and they made a decision to have football, NFL style, all day Sunday, meaning no newscasts. Also tonight, on Monday, no newscasts. We're going to show American football. Who approved that?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a question a lot of people have. To explain a bit of how we approach news, we try to make sure that news is supported through all of our licensing decisions, and we're building that into our decisions now and directing more money towards it, as Chairperson Atreides said. Once that is done, we will be looking at implementing all the changes through the broadcasting system by looking at everyone's conditions of license. I have a suspicion that when we look at Bell's conditions of license, this will be raised. And certainly it'll be something on the public record for us to discuss. We have to be careful as a tribunal, though, not to pronounce in advance where we may or may not go with that. But I think there's a lot of concern about making sure that there is local news available to Canadians and that it is, properly supported with journalistic resources. That is absolutely a question we'll be asking. Having said that, we don't dictate to private broadcasters exactly how to set up their schedule. We can tell them how to spend money on news, and we have and we will, but we don't tell them you have to program something at a particular hour, because then that would be government stamping into operating a private enterprise.
But they are doing so many hours a week of local news. So to pull the pin on a Sunday newscast entirely and Monday at 6 o'clock is just asinine in mine. Now the Google money, if I can.
I'm sorry, Kevin, that is
Okay.
your time. Thank you. We'll go over to the Liberals for 6 minutes. Ms. Al-Sood, Mr. Al-Sood.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. Last week we had 3 Andrews. This time we've got 2 Scotts. We appreciate you all individually. So I'll get right into it. C11 is the byproduct of a reality that I trust everyone in this room agrees on. The old rules won't work in the new reality we all live in. The Broadcasting Act hadn't been updated since 1991, before streaming, smartphones, or YouTube even existed. And if that doesn't reinforce my point, it was before I was born. So for decades, Canadian broadcasters carried obligations to invest in Canadian stories, while global platforms held no such responsibility. I have 2 questions primarily, also bearing in mind and maybe denoting this committee's upcoming study on AI. Could you speak to, 1, the timeliness of this important piece of legislation, and how the CRTC is making sure that this modernization reflects today's digital reality, and that it'll also reflect tomorrow's inevitable reality?
So perhaps I'll start with your second question, and I'll turn things over to Scott Shortliff, our head of broadcasting. So in terms of reflecting the reality, as I mentioned at the outset, we are a quasi-judicial tribunal, so we hold public hearings, and that's how we build a public record upon which to base our decisions. So we ask very open-ended questions, and we get submissions from a wide range of Canadians, businesses, and organizations. So we do ask questions about new digital realities. We've certainly seen artificial intelligence come up as a question, something that came up in the context of Canadian content and what the definition is. So we did hear a lot of perspectives on that during our 3-week hearing in the spring. We are seeing a lot of new, we're seeing radio hosts that are AI, and so, it does raise a lot of questions. We've heard, like the public discourse, a lot of fear about AI. People saying that film and television will no longer be made by humans. There's that fear. There's fear around loss of jobs, and then we've also heard some positive feedback in terms of what AI can do for accessibility and closed captioning and those kinds of initiatives. So we are taking all of these into account. We have certainly been hearing about these new digital realities as part of our public hearings, and that is something that we will be coming back on with our decisions, and maybe I can turn it over to you, Scott.
One of the things that, in addressing your first question about timeliness, one of the things we tried to build into all of our questions in our public hearings, and we've had, as we said, 15 consultations before major public hearings, is try to find out, does anyone have a sense of how things are evolving, and do they have ideas so that we can have rules that will not just work today, but will work in 5 years? And I think we've built up a very interesting public record on that. Participating in our processes have been Canadian storytellers, a diverse number of artists, but also foreign streamers, academics. And it's been crucial for us, and I think for the chairperson or colleagues who, as members of the tribunal, will be voting on this, it's been crucial for us to hear this is where people think the industry is going, but no one knows for sure. Therefore, be very careful as you make rules not to have unintended consequences. And I think in asking those questions, we've built a record where I think we believe we'll be able to issue decisions that will have enough flexibility for the future, that we won't paint ourselves into a corner or create something that will be unsustainable for private sector companies.
Fantastic. Thank you. That was very comprehensive. Bill C-11 aims to level the playing field, promote Canadian culture domestically and globally, support underrepresented creators, modernize outdated laws, ensure reinvestment into the Canadian economy. It's a lot. Could you tell us how Canadians, just plainly, are going to stand to benefit from this?
As you said, it's a lot. I think when we step back and we try to simplify it so that we can, I use the test of, can I go to my dinner table and explain to my family what this bill means? And what I say to them is the ultimate object of this bill is to make sure you have choices. You have choices of Canadian content, diverse Canadian content in the future on different platforms, and you have news. And you have local news and you have national news. And if we can achieve that and keep that sustainable in a global environment that is hyper-competitive, that, I think, is the large-scale success that we read into the bill that was handed to us. A big part of that is also keeping the choices Canadians have. Canadians benefit from having an enormous access to content both within Canada and across the world, and certainly we don't see a role in us trying to limit that, but we want to make sure there's an ecosystem that will give them Canadian choices as they go forward.
Fantastic, thank you. Une question en français sur
A question in French on the matter of topic choices of content. There are around 220% of French content in Spotify in the last 5 years has been obvious. This is a good thing. How will C11 ensure that these voices aren't left to manage the situation on their own? I could begin. Of course, music, audio, broadcasting, which used to go through radio, but now is going online and through other means with some physical devices, but usually Spotify or online now that is replacing physical devices. As you know, given Canada's culture, the Act, the Online Streaming Act, specifies a number of principles. We must ensure that we take care to not only cover the entirety of the Canadian market, but also specifically Francophone ones.
Thank you. Mr. Shampoo for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, all three of you, for being here with us today. Do I understand that it's been 3 years already before we last heard you here before the committee? Nearly, at least 2 years. Oh, wow. What have you done over all that time? I imagine you've been busy? Yes? Perhaps we can line you up for next year. We need to see you every year, I think, to hear about the CRTC. That would be a good idea. So thanks for being here this time. Earlier, you spoke of the decision that you made, what you directed regarding the financial contribution, 5% of revenue of platforms that must go to Canadian content and supporting local content. That's before the courts. There was to be a decision of the federal courts. Really, these days, isn't that correct? Do you have an idea when that decision will come down? Because it's quite an urgent matter. Unfortunately, we don't have an answer to that. We do not know. We hope that the decision will be made soon. So about this CRTC decision, the 5%, which you hold to be around $200 million from the platforms. Of course, that 5% would be spread around 2% for the Canada Media Fund, which would fund Canadian and Quebec content. The platforms have the right, though, according to your decision, to take that money and invest it themselves. What is behind that decision of yours? Did you say that with the 95% of revenue that's left, I mean, the $200 million is about 5% of the revenues of these platforms, generally speaking. So you decided to have them invest in Canadian content and Quebec content. Couldn't they invest more, though, given how much they're making, the fortunes they're making, now that they've penetrated the Canadian market? So I have trouble understanding why you're allowing the platforms to make decisions about how to use the money themselves rather than turning it over to an organization which is well-founded and well-established in Canada. What do you think? I could begin. Well, you know, the idea was to specify initial rates of contribution. It was clear that it was a pressing matter and we needed to move on this, setting in a number of measures to promote and support Canadian content, Anglophone and Francophone. You mentioned that a large percentage of that 5% goes to the core institutions that support television production, audiovisual production, Francophone and Anglophone, but also to other production centers to support, let's say, Indigenous programming or other ethno-cultural communities, and even the OLMCs, official language minority communities. So there's a number of programming avenues available for that funding. Now, you know that 5% is a sum going to those funds which work to ensure that Canadian content is produced. So he allowed for flexibility to ensure that various ways of doing that could be proposed, including having those companies themselves create Canadian content, Canadian products reflecting the local style and content. But they would have to respect the same proportion that would have to be used if they gave the money to the core institutions. All right, but it wasn't necessary to leave that possibility open to them. These are not large sums already. Of course, they're very necessary. They're already very good. Thank you. But would they have reacted any differently had they not been given this possibility? What's likely to happen, I mean, the risk is that they will probably ensure they send as little as possible to the Canadian funding agencies and institutions and just use it the way they want rather than ensuring that recognized Canadian content is supported, that the media fund, would better distribute to, that knows who to give it to. All right, allow me to add something, and then perhaps Scott will have something to add. The concept was indeed to support Canadian contents, to work with Canadian producers, just the way it's done elsewhere, but not directly through the Canadian Media Fund. It was to give them some flexibility, some choice, allowing them to develop approaches that they would have confidence in, to encourage them to invest even further in Canadian and Quebec content. Well, we can certainly see how well-intentioned they are. That's irony. All right, much is being said about showcasing discoverability of Francophone content, Canadian content in general on platforms. And in this bill, C11, I myself put forward an amendment to create 3(1)R, which stipulates that platforms, digital platforms, would be required to invest in methods that would, give real results in matters of discoverability of content. So where have we gotten with that? Have you found the right approach to ensure that? At present, I will let my colleagues speak about the various hearings we've had on this matter. Of course, discoverability is a complex topic. It's also a very important topic. And I will let Scott tell you more about what we're discussing.
Hit the pause button there, but Mr. Champoux can come back to this in his next round. At this point in time, we are going to switch to 5-minute rounds, and we are starting with Mr. Dion.
Thank you so much. Madam CEO, you've probably heard the name Travis Donraj. He was the CBC journalist, and this summer he launched a human rights complaint against the CBC. He says he was silenced because he wanted to include conservative voices on his news show. Does it concern you to hear that certain voices are being quashed by our national broadcaster?
So thank you for the question. This would be a good question to ask the CBC, who I think is appearing before you soon.
You would have no concern about his allegations whatsoever?
So I am aware of those allegations. I do think that's a question for the CBC. The CBC is obviously an independent organization, and we would not be involved in those kinds of matters with the CBC.
Tribunal that regulates the Canadian communication sector. Your strategic plan says that the CRTC is an organization that, quote, respects Canada's diversity, end quote. Does your definition of diversity include a diversity of views and opinions in the Canadian content that the CRTC regulates?
It absolutely does, and we could provide some detail on how it does.
Could you provide a bit of detail yourself right now?
Yeah. So when we license someone, we don't want to tell them what kind of content to have. We do require them to adhere to certain codes. These are codes that were created by the industry. So there's something called the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. It administers codes that were developed by the industry. The CRTC then blessed them and added them to our standard conditions of license for everyone. When someone has a complaint about content, they go to this independent organization who looks into it. Now, from my understanding about the particular complaint you've raised, it has two elements. It has a complaint that voices were silent, and it has a complaint about internal treatment at the CBC Radio Canada, which is obviously a question for their management. We do require that there be equitable portrayal of all points of view, including conservative points of view. We allow that, however, to work through an independent body rather than having us declare whether a standard of fairness is met, because that seems the best way to keep an arm's length between us as a representative of the Canadian government and decisions about what you put on the air.
Thanks. A poll from Public Square Research last year found that 76% of Canadians believe that government subsidies could negatively impact journalistic objectivity. So is the CRTC doing anything to protect diversity of opinion and objectivity on Canadian TV and radio? Actually, I'd like the chair to answer, please.
You want to start or pass it over?
Again, I would come back to our role as a quasi-judicial tribunal, and we fulfill our mandate. I've explained in a number of ways of how we're doing that through the implementation of the new Online Streaming Act, and I will turn it over to my colleague Scott to provide more detail.
Yes, our approach is multifaceted on that approach. It includes everything from what we've already mentioned about complaints and not making decisions about individual programs that are put on air or who is employed by the companies as they are broadcasting on that front, to ensuring that we license as many different parties as possible, that we ensure that there is a diversity of voice through the license system that we have put in place for many of years, and that we are moving forward through new proceedings to look at into the future how to make it easier and make sure that all voices are represented by the system. That's something that is quite key for the CRTC on that front. We've talked about funding and supporting local news, whether it be radio or television or other forms of broadcasting going forward. That is something that that concern as to how we implement that funding to ensure that we remain at arm's length is quite key and is quite important to us. So every time we have set something up in that nature, it has been through independent parties, that the means in which those funds are distributed are also made in a manner that avoids questions of decisions of what is on air and what views are put forward on air.
Mr. Hutton, thank you. That is your time, Mr. Diot. Moving over to Mr. Toomba. You have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very
Merci
much.
beaucoup.
I would like to go back to the topic of support to Canadian content and local creative content. How does the new framework ensure that Canadians will not be disadvantaged by large platforms that work in world settings? Thank you for this question. I don't want to sidestep your question, yet this is a question we've been asking very directly in our public hearings. We ask, how shall we ensure that Canadian producers maintain their independence? What are the measures we need? What support do they need to be able to showcase their stories? So this is something we are looking closely at in our consultations on Canadian audiovisual content. It's also something that we asked in the recent hearings that ended just this week. It's an important question. What I can say is that all things said and done, our framework has to ensure that creators and production in Canada remain independent. Now, you have mentioned Canadian content with respect to music. Could you tell us more where you're headed with that? And I've got a sub-question. Does the CRTC intend to direct platforms to showcase content based on language and region? I'm speaking of regions such as mine in l'Acadie. Perhaps I could begin, and then I will turn the floor over to Scott Shortleaf. We have just had a public hearing addressing this issue. It lasted for 3 weeks, and it just came to an end on Monday. So I'm not sure exactly how much information we can say about that so far. What I can say is that some spoke to us, as you are, saying that we need perhaps more local approaches, more localization in the framework. But, the large platforms, Spotify, Apple, were there. And that panel is, the panel is now looking at that information. But because it is before the panel, perhaps the Broadcasting Telecommunication Legislative Review Panel, I can't speak to it any further as they're examining the material. Basically, how can we ensure that there is local content in which people can see themselves in the regions, not just international content? Having local content is a core concern of ours. That's why we asked the question, how will the CRTC ensure that the C11's application will respect charter rights, in particular freedom of speech? Perhaps I could begin on this. The legislation is clear. The law is clear. We must respect the charter. This is something that's essential to our work at the CRTC. As you know, the Broadcasting Act, as it was first set out in 1991 and now finally changed with the Online Streaming Act, the first large change to it, one of the main clauses is that all our regulations and policies and decisions respect freedom of expression. That concept, and this is a priority even before any other policy issues are addressed. This is an overarching framework that we must keep in mind in all our work. All right. Do you foresee any specific work on the algorithms, such as TikTok algorithms, that will ensure better showcasing for consumers? The legislation specifies that we are not to deal in algorithms.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A little earlier, I was mentioning with some irony the overall approach of the large platforms, thinking of their responsibility to culture in Canada and broadcasting in Canada. Well, Spotify came out this week with a real joke saying that they do a lot for artists. We know this is far from the case. Now, you have these hearings with the broadcasters who are asking for less red tape and also for new quotas on for French music, for example, different formulas. We have representatives of the artistic sector, the music sector, authors, composers, and so on. They also are asking for protection. You've got quite a challenge then, as there are so many sectors that you must protect, broadcasters as well, given that they broadcast the material and then the artists that create the material to be broadcast. So What's your view of the very important paradigm shifts taking place in broadcasting as they affect the various players, including Francophone artists who fear that they will soon disappear from the market entirely, be swept from it? So, as I say, we have a role to play. We're a quasi-judicial body. We hold public hearings. We hear from the major platforms. We hear from the broadcasting sector itself, the cultural sector. We hear all perspectives and look for balance. And that's how we make our decisions. You have a duty, though, so to speak, to protect this industry itself, the Canadian industry. Do you have that in mind as you listen to people who come before you? Or do you have, let's say, hopefully some sort of a correct and favorable bias in favor of supporting Canadian content? You know, in matters of administration, we cannot hold one player in more favorably than any other. But of course, we work with the legislation that has been handed down to us. There are a number of objectives there about Canadian artists.
Moving on to a 5-minute round. Our first MP up is Mr. Dawson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here today. Can CRTC confirm the purpose of the local news fund?
I just want to make sure that I know which fund you're asking about. So we have a series of local news funds. We have an independent local news fund for television stations, which has existed for a long time, but which we are expanding following our decision this summer. It will probably go out to another 15 stations or so. We are creating a commercial radio news fund for radio stations outside of major centres. We anticipate more than 500 radio stations across Canada will be eligible for funding for support for news operations from that fund. And of course, we are involved in the administration of C-18, which is to say the Online News Act, by which $100 million is being provided to broadcasters and news organizations and newspapers across Canada. So we actually have several news funds that we're involved with at the moment.
Can CRTC confirm which one Chorus was added to in their fund, and if they're taking 40% of the whole fund without any additional money being added to the fund?
Okay, that is in reference to the Independent Local News Fund, the ILNF. The decision was made to add Chorus because they are no longer what is called a vertically integrated broadcaster. It was made with the intention of the additional monies coming from the base contribution decision, which would in fact increase the fund from 18 million to 42 million, in which case we can add those funds. Since that decision has been held up by the courts, we haven't distributed that money yet, but it wasn't a decision to add them to the fund without adding additional money to the fund.
Okay, thank you. How will Chorus use the fund as it's related to local news, and will CRTC protect the delivery of the local news?
So the way the fund is administered, it's fun, as Mr. Hutton indicated earlier, we don't directly administer these funds. It will be administered through the Canadian Association of Broadcasters. They are to set up standards where Chorus and anyone who receives the fund reports on the number of journalists they have, which determines the funding they get. It's related to their status through Revenue Canada as a qualified journalistic organization. So Chorus will have to make commitments in terms of its journalism. If it reduces its journalism, it receives less through the fund. Our hope is that by having made this decision to provide them access, it will actually strengthen local news through Chorus across Canada.
Did CRTC evaluate the impact and the consequences that the decision will have on the smaller broadcasters that deliver local news and depend on the fund to survive?
It was absolutely a part of our calculations in creating the fund. Is one of the reasons why we did put limits on the amount that Chorus could actually receive out of that fund, to make sure that other entities who are supported by the fund would continue to be supported by the fund and would not be displaced.
Does CRTC have any concerns? Can they advise the committee on what the direct impact and the decision for the smaller broadcasters?
We don't see the decision as having a negative impact on small broadcasters. We realize that a number of them have concerns, which they have raised, saying that, if the court rules another way and the money is not forthcoming, what does that mean? At that point, they would, of course, be free to make an application to the commission, which the commission would consider then. But we are proceeding on the basis that we made that decision, saying that it will let more stations into the fund. However, the existing stations will continue to be strongly supported. More stations will be supported on the basis of more money coming into the fund.
What corrective measures will be taken to ensure smaller independent broadcasters aren't destabilized or crowded out of the larger players now assessing this fund?
Well, as I said, the way the fund has been set up, it should have no negative impacts on smaller players. In the case that there is less money in the fund because the courts rule against us, that would be a hypothetical that, as a tribunal, we can't address what measures we might or might not take. We would have to assess the facts on the ground at that time.
Do you have any plans to add more money to the budget to help the smaller broadcasters deliver the local news?
I think what we can say is that we are going to be continuing to look at news in a holistic way in the weeks, months, and years to come, and that if needed, the tribunal, of course, will look at what is needed to support local news across Canada. I think the decisions we took this summer will provide substantial support to local news across Canada, and that we'll continue to focus on local news going forward.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson, that's your time. Thank you. I will now go over to Mr. Miles for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just think some context would be helpful. I'm particularly interested in the Canadian creative ecosystem, and I think some context around where traditionally some of the money has come from for the Canadian Music Fund and some of these other funds that Martin's been bringing up as well has come from broadcasters. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how that's happened in the past and how that revenue has tracked over the last number of years. What's been the trend? And some of the motivations obviously behind C11 was that money wasn't coming in from broadcasters as it has traditionally been. Maybe you can just give us a sense of that context and what that's looked like over the last 20 years, 15 years.
So if we're looking more economically as a question on that front, our main approach, if we're talking our support for music, has been through radio station regulations and other new ventures that have come upon the various number of years, satellite radio or, for example, Stingray does have a product that is on the cable channels also. All of those approaches are either you help by making sure there is an availability of Canadian music on your airwaves, if I can oversimplify it on that front, and contribute dollars to something we call Canadian Content Development Funds, which then those dollars there serve to help create new music, both the creation, but also the marketing and the distribution of that music across not only Canada, but across the world on that front. So that's sort of the high level on that front. Naturally, radio stations' revenues have been declining over the last number of years, so those funds have in fact diminished slightly, both addressing Francophone and Anglophone markets there. So that's certainly with us having moved forward, looking at the new streamers and asking them to contribute dollars going forward. That's how we will be addressing that diminishing support that is based on radio revenue. Something similar with respect to cable television. Mr. Champoux mentioned the CMF, not the Canadian Music Fund, but the people who support television in that case has been widely supported by both government and by cable, a percentage of cable revenues. Generally, 3 to 5% of cable revenues have been supported on that front. Those funds have also been diminishing as Canadians are subscribing less and less to cable. When we started all of these adventures, we were probably around 90% penetration of cable, and now you're looking at something more akin to 60. All forms of cable, whether it's IP or satellite, is what I'm mentioning in that case there. So government has stepped in over the last number of years to backstop that diminishing amount, but that certainly is what, decisions that were made with our initial contributions to ask the streamers to start contributing to those funds. So that's how we're working the system on that side. The vast majority of production dollars, however, come from actual, whether it's the companies who have licenses in this country are in fact have requirements, a percentage of, again, their revenue to contribute towards programming, which includes local news, but will include other forms of programming and actual production by for their own airwaves by themselves. So that's the other regime. On that front, certainly local television has been struggling for a number of years, whereas the other big component has been a component related to specialty channels, and that has, however, been more robust over the last number of years. So hopefully that's a high level.
Oh, sorry, that's exactly what I was looking for, is just kind of getting a sense of how that's diminished, obviously, because as Martin has brought up, this becomes a matter of expediency to a certain degree because that money is declining year after year as the radio licenses aren't being sold or wherever the generation was happening. I guess I'm curious. I'm curious to know the 5%. How does it compare to the previous amount that was generated through some of these radio and television? Is it an equitable amount, or is it going to be greater?
Perhaps I'll jump in there. So when we established the 5%, we said this was base contributions. This was, for lack of a better term, table stakes for entry into the Canadian system. We had a lot of evidence on that record that said it is equivalent to what certain companies had to do, what we call BDUs, broadcast distribution undertakings. It is less than Canadian broadcasters have to do. They have a bigger percentage they have to spend. There is a record which is before us now as part of our hearings this summer where we asked that question, what is equitable? Because the Act says it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but it needs to be equitable.
I'm sorry,
and that
Mr.
is before
Shortland.
us, so we don't have decisions we can announce on that yet.
Thank you. That is the end of your time, Mr. Miles. As the committee members know, this is not normally the seat I occupy. I am vice chair of this committee, therefore here in this seat because of the absence of our chair. That said, I did prepare a question round, and so I will take that opportunity at this point in time then, and I'll ask the clerk to set the timer for 5 minutes. Thank you. As has been mentioned, streamers are required to pay 5% of their Canadian revenue over to the CRTC, which goes into a fund, or they can invest money directly into the production of Canadian content. Now, in order to do that, they would need to know what Canadian content is. Is there a redo on that definition? Do we have a new definition with regards to CanCon?
So when we made that decision, there was an existing definition. The hearing we had this May was specifically on whether there should be a new definition, and we had input, including from streamers, on various propositions we had on what a new definition might look like or whether we should keep the same one. I can tell you that there will be a decision forthcoming on that in the not too distant future, but unfortunately we have not issued a decision yet, so I cannot provide any more precision on what it will look like in the future.
Okay. With regards to the fund that is put aside, will streamers have an opportunity to apply for money from that fund in order to produce Canadian content?
One of the things we did, and this relates to the point that Monsieur Champoux raised earlier, was we said there are two ways they could contribute. One would be through the Canada Media Fund, which we do not directly manage. So the Canada Media Fund has a question before it whether it would allow streamers to access its funds or not. We do not manage the Canada Media Fund, so that is up for them to determine. In recognition of the fact that they said, would we have flexibility in this way, we provided them an alternate way, say, you can invest directly. It was a great deal of that fund. If you want to commission Canadian content, you can do so. I can say that there are some cases where streamers have said to us, we have commissioned or participated in elements of Canadian content. Our practice is not to mention specific title names when we're at a hearing, but they have done some of that. We've been trying to explore ways that they can contribute to the system where it's not just them contributing to funds, but ways that they can invest in the system themselves. And I will say that is very much a work in progress. And obviously, once we have a final decision on definitions of Canadian content, that may affect how they adjust their approach.
The same question goes for digital creators. Will they have the opportunity to apply for funds?
So we don't support individual creators. We support funds that commission programming. So individual creators, if they are creating a program, can go to those fund administrators, but we don't create funds that typically support individual creators directly.
Okay. How does Bill C-11 make the internet better?
So that's a big question. Again, I would come back to our role with respect to C-11, and that is the implementation of the legislation. We're a quasi-judicial tribunal, so we are implementing the legislation that was given to us by Parliament.
So I understand that. I think you and I could probably agree that the definition of success in terms of the implementation of Bill C-11 would be to serve the Canadian public to a greater extent. So how does Bill C-11 do that?
So we are here to work in the public interest. So again, coming back to our role, we are here to ensure that we are putting in place or implementing a regime that has been given us by Parliament to make sure that we are including online streamers in the regulatory regime.
So again, the implementation of Bill C-11. The CRTC, I would imagine, is motivated by wanting to implement it in such a way that serves the intent of Parliament. And at the time, the minister said that it would make the internet better for Canadians. How are you implementing it in order to achieve that goal?
So again, and I would point to what my colleague, Mr. Shortlift, said. By implementing C-11, it does support the Canadian broadcasting system. It does offer choice to Canadians in terms of what they're able to watch, what they're able to consume. And obviously there's an economic perspective to that as well in terms of supporting the broadcasting system.
I can appreciate what you just said. So you just outlined how it makes the broadcasting system better, but how does it make the internet better?
We're bound, I guess it's a question of selection of words. I, who have responsibilities both on the broadcasting side of our house and the telecom side of our house. The pure internet is the pure pipe that delivers product to Canadians. What C-11 is doing is making sure that product is delivered to Canadians.
Mr. Hutton, I have to call time on myself, to be fair. But thank you. I do appreciate that. At this point in time, then, let me just take a quick look here. We go to Miss Royer, correct? Okay, thank you very much. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, esteemed colleagues, and to our panel. Thank you very much for joining us today. So once the new framework is fully implemented, what kind of experiences can Canadian viewers expect daily, like in their experience with Netflix, with Spotify, with YouTube? What would that look like?
Thank you very much for the question. And unfortunately, again, I cannot provide a precise answer because those are the questions before us. I think what we've heard in the presentations we've had throughout the summer is that people value having access to lots of content, including foreign content. At the same time, they want to have the opportunity to find Canadian content. So it really goes to the question about discoverability. We've posed this question directly in all three of the hearings we've had in the last couple of months. We've also commissioned a study on discoverability looking at the best practices around the world, which we'll receive shortly and which we will make public, because I think that is the key question. And I think the dividing line that the Commission has to walk is that we don't want to interfere with what people love about platforms, whether they're streaming platforms or any other way of getting content. At the same time, we want to make sure there are options there that they could see Canadian content and access them easily, that they're not buried somewhere, 15 clicks into something. So that is exactly the question that is before us, and we look forward to being able to come back in the future and describe what our decisions were and how they will achieve that.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you raised the business of discoverability. How will you measure Canadian success rate in finding and discovering and being able to actually see Canadian content?
That's actually that's a fascinating question, and I'm going to try and do this in a pithy manner and not be sort of a geek on this. One thing that became clear as we met with intervener after intervener is they said the data is everything. That you cannot measure success unless you have data, and unless you have that, you don't know what you're getting. And it was frankly fascinating to even talk to some of the streamers, not just foreign streamers, but streaming companies in Canada who talked about the challenges of seeing, is this Canadian? If it is Canadian, is it Anglo, or is it Anglophone, or is it Francophone? Is it Indigenous? Is it not? And I think what we walked away from is an appreciation that discoverability is difficult because, first of all, you need clear definitions, which we are in the process of creating. Secondly, you need to make sure that those are widely shared and widely understood. And thirdly, that there's then an infrastructure so that you can share them and you're not comparing apples and oranges. And I think it's a huge task in front of us, but I think it's one that we as staff also find enervating, because if we can get this right, then we will be able to compare apples to apples, and we will therefore be able to have success measures that will be useful and transparent, not just for us, but for Canadians.
Amazing. It really is an enormous task ahead. In terms of implementation of major reform like this one, what have been some of the biggest challenges so far that you've experienced, and what have you learned from that will guide you into the future?
Maybe I'll start. I would say one of the biggest challenges is that it is it's a monumental task, and it's finding that right balance. We know that everybody needs certainty. We've heard the urgency. We heard that at our public hearings, how important it is to move quickly, that measures need to be put in place right away. So we've heard that. So we've heard the need to move quickly, and it's balancing that with making sure that we're consulting widely as we have been told to do. So it is in our nature as a quasi-judicial tribunal, but also this legislation does put in place additional requirements in terms of consultation. So it's always finding that right balance to make sure that that we're moving quickly and consulting broadly.
Is that time? Okay. All right. Can you share examples of how the CRTC is ensuring that voices of Indigenous, French, English minority communities, youth, and other equity-seeking groups are being captured?
And quickly, we have something that we call engagement teams. So we built something called the Indigenous Relations Team. We have a similar team with official language minority groups. We're doing something similar with accessibility, with consumer groups, going out there and trying to make it easier. We are a tribunal, we said, but trying to make it easier to come and share their views so that our decisions can take them into consideration. And I think that's the approach that we are giving ourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Hutton. I will go to Mr. Champeau for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Madame Maitreidis,
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam, in your opening statement, you opened the door to other topics other than broadcasting. So I would like to talk to you about the decision that came down allowing large broadcasting and firms to sell subscriptions using small networks. So that was an approach to help break the monopoly when it's well used, at least. So it's allowed some firms, let me give you Cogeco, for example, because it's operating in the center of Quebec, in my region, and in the Mauricie region, and they've decided to invest in the networks. But allowing the big players in, well, the small players won't be able to invest to maintain the network. So you say you've brought in measures to ensure that investments flow into the regions, but if the decision you've rendered is upheld, then this won't work. It'll cost even the large companies a lot to keep the network up and running, so they won't even want to go there. So we'll basically, one way or the other, wind up with networks that won't be kept and operating in working order. So how do you intend to solve that? Thank you for the question. The decision that we made, I think there was 18 months of consultation behind it, underpinning it with public hearings, and we heard a number of players in the sector. We heard from the Competition Bureau and consumer organizations as well. The decision we made was really about competition and investment. Competition because we wanted to ensure that consumers have a choice and at lower prices should they so wish, but we put in measures to promote investment as well. For example, we decided not to give access over 5 years, for one. Also, the rates that the players pay to the large players to get access take into account the investment, how much it costs, because we know it is expensive.
The next 5-minute round here is Mr. Waugh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Google money, they came through with $100 million, I think. 63 million was distributed, I think digital media and some newspapers. Let me ask you this. What does success look like to the CRTC? I don't buy that you care about local news because it's all about money, and if the newsrooms aren't at the trough, they disappear, as we've seen in every province of this country. So what does success look like to the CRTC?
So maybe I can start off, and I can turn things over to Scott, who's overseeing the work on the Online News Act. So success would be fulfilling our role that we've been given as a tribunal, which is to ensure the administration of the Online News Act. The CJC, or the Canadian Journalism Collective, has been set up to ensure that money is distributed, and they decide who that goes to. So ensuring that money is distributed by the CJC and that role is fulfilled would be success for us in terms of our role.
But I think you've said here for the last hour and a half, newsrooms, it's not really a priority. Well, you say it's a priority, but I don't see the correlation between the money being handed down to TV and radio stations, because that's the first cut they make is local news. I've talked about it here. I will ask you this. How much money is it going to take from the government at the end of the day to make this successful? To make your organization carry out what Canadians want? How much money?
That's a very big question to ask and involves a lot of speculation.
Give us a number. Give us a number.
I don't have such a number. It's not there, and quite frankly, money isn't the only solution. That's why we are looking at a whole bunch of different things. We've spoken often enough about conditions of license to ensure that those who do have licenses in those markets are producing local news, are investing in it also. Those are two different types and conditions of license we have in place with them. There's the Google money that's flowing. We have created new funds to help support businesses that produce news, and very precise, that support is dependent upon how many reporters you hire and are on staff on that front. So that is directly, it's going to news. It's the people finding the news. So it has been quite important, and support from our end on that
So
front.
who follows up, Scott? Who follows up when the CTV network decides not to have local news on Sunday and Monday? Does the CRTC used to get a 7-year contract for a license? Is there any licenses anymore? Because I'm sure CTV did not have that in their license. Radio-wise, I can tell you here's what's happening. I can do the morning show in Saskatoon from 6 to 9. Then I go off the air and I'm doing the mid-morning in Calgary. You knew this. This is what owners are doing to shave money, to stay alive in this country. So a number of so-called disc jockeys or morning shows, they'll do them, then they turn around. We're in Edmonton now. It's quarter to the hour. I don't know what hour it is, but I have the mid-morning show from 9 to noon. So I don't see the CRTC following up with certain broadcasters in this country about what I just talked about, local news and radio stations that are doing programming like I just mentioned. And that was years ago. We were all scared of the CRTC. Now, nobody gives a damn about you guys. I'm going to be honest, because you don't follow up.
You've shifted from television to radio.
Yeah, I did
on
both.
that front. I think we've had many discussions over the years about television. We do follow up, and there have been precise rules in place to support local news on television stations. And yes, CTV does have rules or regulations applied to it in that instance. On respect to radio, radio had been for decades producing local news and putting it on air, and so therefore regulation was not needed on that front there.
It is
we are
now.
looking at various proceedings right now on how we can help, and one of the radio related items was to support, have a fund that supports news for the first time on radio, on commercial radios, on markets that are across the country in more rural areas, because that was identified as the area of prime concern at our hearing. So we do care, and we have been putting in place measures to help.
Yeah, it doesn't do anybody any good. This is
Mr. Waugh.
broadcast news because it's not local.
Mr. Waugh, that's your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving over then to Mr. Toomba.
Merci. On va revenir en...
I would like to go back to the application, the real setup. What mechanisms will be brought in to manage the situations where streaming platforms don't respect the rules? My colleague, Mr. Shortlift, mentioned this earlier. Your question is maybe a little bit cart before the horse for us, in as much as we are now organizing the policies, the needs, all the measures, everything that they need to respect in the sector. We're looking at Canadian content, fair market, also spoken content. And so, yes, indeed, we will have measures that they need to respect, and then we will get involved with ensuring that they respect them. We're not there yet. Perhaps I could add 2 elements. Now, with the new bill, we have new tools. If an entity breaks the rules, we need to ask for the data. In some cases, it's possible to impose monetary penalties. So we have a toolbox if they don't respect the rules. Thank you. how will your new requirements support and foster local media? Because in the regions, this is really an important issue. I know that now you're just winding up a whole series of consultations. That's lovely. But looking forward to your final decisions, what you will decide based on these consultations, how do you think you will really leave room for local media really be able to showcase them? It's really important in the regions. These are the questions we are asking in all our hearings, whether about music. I mentioned earlier the development of Canadian content, the funds that work to that, and these are funds that are distributed in all markets across the country. All radio stations invest in their local production. And how we see this going forward in the digital age, this is digital world, this is something we are working on. If we want to support organizations that are able to use these funds, and if we manage to do that, we'll be able to foster local content across the country. So keeping in mind your neutrality, there are some issues that are coming to the forefront across the country. In Quebec, more particularly, minority issues, the Francophone minority. Has the CRTC foreseen how, in the coming weeks, how it will provide for more showcasing of Francophone material even outside Quebec? Even today, we are meeting with our engagement committee, which allows us to work closely with communities, producers, journalists, creators, musicians, even community radios. These are all people who are very involved with us, actually, and we try to consult them as much as possible in order to better reflect in our hearings the decisions that are required to support them. The communities across the country, as you know, Anglophone communities in Quebec, Francophone communities outside of Quebec. These are people who are deeply involved, and we support them with the funding we render available to them for their communities. I met a number of witnesses, for example, a group representing Black creators, and of course, you have an approach, or directed to have an approach regarding racialized and other equity-seeking communities. What are you actually doing? Well, we are an administrative tribunal, and so you have 5 seconds. We work very hard to ensure that it is easy to come to the CRTC and to express your opinion.
To Mr. Champ. Oh, I'm so sorry. To Mr. Diot. We will move over to Mr. Diot for 5 minutes and then over to Mr. Champ.
I'd like to return once again to the issue of diversity, specifically diversity of opinion. So what is the CRTC doing specifically to ensure that Canadians are getting a diversity of opinion in the media that they're exposed to?
So perhaps I could start off and turn things over to our head of broadcasting. So maybe just addressing a couple of points. One is that as part of the implementation of the new legislation, we are looking at that issue of how we can increase the diversity. Another thing I would say is through all of our licensing decisions that we do in broadcasting, which my colleague could speak about, we do ensure that we are licensing a number of different broadcasters who have diversity of views and perspectives. We could provide more detail.
Sure, a bit more is good.
So we have a couple of different lenses to when we approach licensing decisions. One of them is when someone approaches and looks for a license, we look at the market, make sure that there is enough economic room in a market. We also do try to emphasize that there should be diversity of opinion. Now, I'm talking about, in this case, radio, because there's only so much spectrum. When we look at television, we license a vast variety of for television services. We also permit a large number of foreign services to broadcast in Canada, which present a wide variety of point of views. I think we pride ourselves on trying to make sure that Canadians have access to as many different opinions as possible. We also do have journalistic codes and equitability codes, which are then administered by the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. So when there are complaints about viewpoints being shut down, that there is somewhere to take those complaints towards. So we're trying to build a system that has as much diversity of opinion in it as possible.
Thanks for that. You have a lot of public consultations, obviously. You've talked about it. Do you have any plans to hold consultations on fair representation of diverse opinions in Canadian radio and TV? Anything coming up?
I have to be a little bit coy here because as a tribunal, until we've announced something publicly, we don't speak about what our future plans are. What I can say, and we've expressed this in the past, is that when we finish this major policy work, which we have a bit of the end in sight, that does not mean all of our work is done. There are a number of issues we need to follow up on, and certainly we have more questions to answer. And unfortunately, there I have to be a bit coy and stop, but to say that questions about fair representation in a different media system is obviously an important one for the future.
Thank you. Does the CRTC currently monitor online and broadcast content for hate speech?
So what we do is we operate on a complaint basis. Two kinds of things. When we issue a license, we don't issue licenses to online entities currently, but you have broadcasters. When we issue a license, we typically do, when we're renewing their license, we do compliance checks to make sure that they've met their requirements. That can happen every couple of years. The other thing we do is we respond to public complaints, usually around license renewal time. If someone comes and says that there has been a problem with content on, say, a radio station, we will look at that issue either at license renewal time, or if we get enough complaints that's serious enough, we can obviously do it off cycle. We don't do it on a regular basis. I don't have a staff who sits there monitoring everybody, and at the same time, we try to make sure that we are responsive and responsible in dealing with any issues that are brought to us.
Sorry, and perhaps I could just add something very briefly. And so just coming back to something that we had talked about earlier, there are very formal processes in place. So to the extent that there are concerns about what's being broadcast, if it's through a private broadcaster and the concerns or complaints are about them, that goes through the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. And if it's about a public broadcaster, any concerns or complaints about that content would go through the ombuds for that public broadcaster.
Just very quickly, what's your definition of hate?
Because we, as Vicky was just explaining, we don't manage those complaints directly. We do not have a definition of hate that we apply. And if there is a separate case brought to us, we treat each case on its merits.
Thank you.
So you have no definition of hate speech?
That's your time. Mr. Miles, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Madam Chair. I think we're speaking about Bill C-11 mainly here, so I'm going to come back to C-11. I just want to say, first of all, that it is a very important piece of legislation for all the reasons we've talked about, I think, today, particularly in the money that had been generated to the ecosystem over a number of years, and also regulating the digital space as traditional broadcasting has been regulated for years and years, and has benefited Canadians and Canadian content. And there's no reason why we can't move into the future and do the same thing in the digital realm and the internet era. And I understand that it's huge work, and I commend you on it. I am a little concerned about enforcement. Maybe you can't talk about it a little bit, but maybe you can. The legal challenge I guess what I'm really curious about is some of the resistance that you've received from the streaming services, and what this the legal challenge looks like.
So I will turn things over to my colleague Scott in just a moment. What I would say is that yes, there are legal challenges before the courts, but I would say in terms of the public proceedings that we've held, we did receive a diverse number of views, including for the streamers on those public proceedings.
Yeah, I think what we can say there is the streamers participate in our public proceedings. On one of the proceedings, they ultimately declined to appear in person, but they did in fact make written representations, responded to our request for information, of which we had many, and provided final replies. So they've been fully involved even to the last few days where Spotify and Apple appeared at our audio hearing. So we have seen them be very willing to engage with us. In terms of the legal proceeding, it's before the courts, obviously. We can't refer to it, what the court decision will be. I will note that simply in what they put before the court, they raised a number of technical issues as well as an overall issue. We don't know where the courts will go with any of this, but we need to proceed on with our work. Appeal to the courts is someone everyone has the right to do. They have the right to do it. Frankly, Canadian broadcasters and other entities have had recourse to the courts with other CRTC decisions in the past. It is a normal course of business. We will see what the courts decide, and in the meantime, we will continue on administering the act that Parliament entrusted us with.
This is a nerdy question. I'm just wondering about accounting. How do you trust their accounting on the 5% amount?
Well, that's my job. We have various data is king. We have received, certainly they are sharing some data with us, so we do get amounts directly from them with respect to subscribers or revenues. But there is also a number of other services out there that we subscribe to be able to estimate and verify that those numbers are correct.
So they have been forthcoming with the numbers.
They have been forthcoming with their own information, and as with everyone else, we do verify it, and we have different means to be able to do that at the CRTC.
Is there any concept of timeline around some of the CanCon definitions?
I'm going to be incredibly coy here, but say that coming soon. We've been working very hard on this, and coming soon.
I appreciate it. It's obviously they're really complex questions and very important questions, I think, for all of us, because it will greatly determine obviously what gets funding and how we're going to work towards discoverability. I'm curious about discoverability being a big question. Has there been resistance in actually modifying the algorithm itself?
Well, as Mr. Hutton mentioned in answer to an earlier question, the bill actually says we cannot require them to touch the algorithm. I will say that on the record, the streaming companies have been quite forthcoming about what they do for discoverability, what they see as potential options are. And, when we've said to them, will you continue to engage with us around discoverability as we investigate it more, they certainly seem open to that dialogue. Now, does that mean that they will like our eventual decisions, or we can't say? But they have indicated that they understand the importance of this and engaging in this discussion with us, as have traditional broadcasters and other players in Canada. I think everyone realizes that discoverability is an absolutely key question when you're talking about Canadian content, because simply having it produced and sitting on a shelf is not good enough. I see I'm getting the hook, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Shortlick. I will go over to Mr. Champoux for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm concerned about this court ruling. If the court sides with the streaming platforms to the effect that the streaming platforms needn't turn over the 5%, what recourse do you have? Could the CRTC, in and of itself, make another decision and, start from there? Or must we go back to legislation and provide for an amendment, a change to the bill? So that depends a lot on the decision that's rendered. If the court rules that our decision is unacceptable, then it will depend on them, what they say. Then we would know what we do next. Do you have any feeling about where the court is going? The viability of your decision? Is it a good decision? I think it is. But unfortunately, no, we have no idea what the court will decide. All right, interesting. Earlier, we had started to discuss the sharing of infrastructure for cellular and internet services. You say there are measures that force the large companies to reinvest in network infrastructure. I don't want to single out any specific companies, but let's say you've got TELUS and Rogers, let's say in my area of the world, and they offer services using the existing infrastructure. Are they obliged to invest in the market where they will be making money, or do they only have to invest in their own infrastructure? The measures that we have are to ensure that those who rent their lines invest correctly. We don't examine all the investments they make in each market. That would have to do with their rates. We basically would ensure that they have the revenues to keep up their networks, the infrastructure. We also look at the reliability and of the networks, how durable they are. We have looked at that in certain areas, and we're undertaking that elsewhere based on everything, the environment, everything in the environment. Yes.
I will move on for another 5-minute round to to Mr. Dawson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't hear an answer if Chorus was getting 40% of the independent fund. All I got was that the fund was going from 18 to 42 million. Can you answer how much Chorus is getting?
I don't have a precise answer yet because the fund will be administered by the Canadian Association of Broadcasters based on submissions to it. It could be up to 40%. That's a maximum we put in, but I cannot give you a precise number yet because it has not yet been determined.
Is there any indication on what it's going to be?
I simply don't have the numbers. I'm sorry.
Are there any restrictions with the fund that's being given to Chorus?
It needs to be expended on news on the same basis that would need to be expended by independent local news company, other independent local news television broadcasters.
Can they use the funds for operating budgets? Or are there any restrictions? Can they hire new staff, raise salaries, balance their budget with new funds? Or is the money restricted to providing additional service to the listeners?
That's an interesting question. They can spend it in many different ways, as other news organizations can, because there's a question about what quality news is. That can lead to more investment in your back office. It can lead to hiring new journalists. They do have some flexibility on doing that, but it needs to be determined that it is being spent on news. As with any of our programs, of course, we will be doing a review of it in the future to see what the ultimate effects are and if it's had the effect we intend, which is to provide for better and stronger local news across Canada.
With Chorus potentially getting 40% of the local news fund given out, should I expect local news in my riding or in rural New Brunswick? Are we going to lose out to the bigger Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, places where they don't understand where Blackville or Minto or Chipman, the smaller rural parts of my riding in rural New Brunswick?
That is certainly not the intention of any of the funds we're providing. And in fact, we've specified, especially on the radio side, that we want investments outside the major centers. And in terms of television news, we want to see investments to be kept locally and not have everything fed through the 5 largest cities in Canada. So that is certainly absolutely the intention of our funding.
How many people are employed by the CRTC?
So currently we have about 750 people. That includes roughly 60 people who are temporary resources just for the year to get us through moving ahead on the Online Streaming Act. So those are temporary resources that will not exist in a year.
Okay. Since the Streaming Act was enacted, so you're saying 60 since, is that how many you've added since the Streaming Act?
We received funding for roughly 60 people to help us through the Online Streaming Act, and again, that's temporary, so that funding will disappear next year.
I'll turn the rest of my time over to you, Chair.
All right, well, thank you. My question is this, to date, how much money has been collected based on the 5% of revenue from Canadian revenue, has been remitted to the CRTC?
I'll answer that. So none of it comes directly to the CRTC. And one of the things we did when we made our base contribution decision is we set up a mechanism where the streamer said, can we have an independent company who will administer it to preserve some of their corporate secrecy. They were allowed to do that, so there is an independent body that is collected and will administer the money and will disperse the money and will report to us on both the money it is received from the streamer so that we can do the accounting that Mr. Hutton talked about and that will go out. Because of the court ruling...
If I may, I think the question is clear. What is the amount then that has been remitted, whether to the CRTC or to a third party?
We do not have an accounting yet because, as the courts have not ruled, they have not been required to provide us with the money that has been collected and what money will be dispersed.
Okay. So because of the court order then, there's a stay, and so therefore no revenue or percentage of revenue has been yet collected.
We understand that the money has been received in trust and is being held. And in fact, we have been told that at the choice of the streamers, some has actually been distributed to some of the recipients. They're not legally required to do that. They have chosen to do so. Our complete accounting will come once the courts have ruled, and then we will receive a complete report on what has been collected and what has been paid out.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, that is my time. Moving over to Ms. Royer for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. On the topic of consultation with stakeholders, I know that it was in response to Mr. Natumba, and it was raised later as well. In my riding, in beautiful West Coast BC, the riding of Port Moody Coquitlam, we have some producers. One of them is Tri-Cities Community TV, which represents 5 communities of the 21 Lower Mainland Metro Vancouver communities. That's one organization. The other one is the Canadian Ethnic Media Producer Association. And in my riding, there are specific outlets, so Parvaz Media and Korean TV Media in my riding, amongst others. They actually represent about 85 producers across Canada. That's the Canadian Ethnic Media Producers Association. I know that they are looking for sustainable support. In the context of consultation, has the window closed, or are you still seeking consultation with stakeholders?
So I think what I could say is the specific hearings we've had this summer have closed and the records have closed, but we are always seeking consultation with stakeholders. And in fact, with numerous stakeholders, we're saying if we're not holding a consultation, but you want to better understand what we're doing and what you might do in the future, reach out to us. Call me. If you contact Vicky, she will put you in touch with me or the other Scott or anyone else in the organization could help them. We encourage people to reach out to us and start communicating with us, and we will keep on a dialogue with them. And then part of our job then is also to give them the best information on how they can intervene on the record in our proceedings and be taken into account in our future decisions. So certainly there are some specific windows that have closed, but if I may say, the grand window remains open, and we encourage people to, I'm going to mix my metaphors, walk through the door to see us.
I really appreciate that response, and I think it will be music to their ears, so thank you for that. Looking ahead, what milestones should Parliament and Canadians watch for as final implementation steps continue, and how will you track the outcomes such as audience reach, employment, investment, and growth in the creative sector?
So perhaps I can start and turn things over to my colleagues. So I would say in terms of the milestones coming up, like we mentioned, there have been a number of major proceedings and major public hearings that have just taken place over the summer. In the coming weeks and months, these major decisions will be released. I think that the big policy part of implementation of the Online Streaming Act will be completed over the next several months. After that, there will be specific conditions of service that we will need to follow up on with respect to certain companies. In all of our work, and I would say this on the broadcasting as well as the telecommunications side, it's very important to monitor. And this sort of comes back to a previous question about what's happening with telecommunications. So we have said very publicly that we need to continue to monitor to make sure that the measures that we're putting in place are meeting the objectives that we are trying to meet.
Pardon me. Thank you for that. And I guess just to sum up, with the Online Streaming Act, could you sort of very concisely, like your pitch, how will it strengthen Canada's cultural sovereignty in this digital era?
I think, it is what Parliament gave us and asked us to do. What it will do is it will make sure Canadians continue to have choices. It's not, our understanding of the Act is not forcing Canadians to take any of those choices, but to make sure that they're there. And in response to one of the questions from one of your colleagues earlier, we talked a bit about the ecosystem and how the ecosystem has developed to fund both music and television content in Canada, but has been under stress as revenues have declined. We're trying to find a sustainable path forward so that Canadians will be able to continue to listen to the music they want and have Canadian choices in it, to have it in both official languages, and to have choices on their television screens, and in all of those to have choices that reflect their local experiences and local news. That to us will be, I believe, the definition of success, and that is the path we are on trying to implement.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is time. We are headed into the final round in the sense that we will have one period of questions from the Conservatives, another from the Liberals, and then from the Bloc Québécois. And then we'll be bringing this meeting to a close. So with that, I will be the Conservative member asking questions during this round. On the note of choice, you said that you want to be able to explain to your family what Bill C-11 does. You said it's about creating choice. How has Bill C-11 provided greater choice within the sphere of the internet for Canadians?
Well, our interpretation of the bill is we weren't asked to regulate the entire internet as it stands. And in fact, the bill is very careful to say in the policy direction that we should not be regulating the programming of social media creators. So I would step back and say we weren't given the task of making sure that the internet as a whole will be better. What we were asked to do was look at where there is broadcasting, including by streamers, and to make sure that there are Canadian choices available or support for the Canadian system on that. And I will say it's a work in progress. We have our base contribution decision, which we think will help with local news, with French content, with Indigenous content, with content for racialized Canadians. That is an important start. In terms of the other things we want to achieve, it is still a work in progress, but we're very pleased that we've had robust public consultations and are now at the point where shortly we're going to be able to come out with concrete decisions that will allow us to return and answer your question more fulsomely.
Isn't it Isn't it true, though, that there really is more choice than ever before in the online sphere, and in particular with streamers and, Spotify and Apple Music, etc. It's why people, as Missy Treaties rightly pointed out, are switching more and more from cable television and what we would call traditional broadcast systems to streamers. It's because they're drawn to choice, and that choice is made available to them often at a fragment of the cost. Is that not true?
I would say there's enormous choice available on streaming services, and this is very much something we want to support. Part of choice, though, is that if you're Canadian, you can find Canadian content. That is an element of choice. So I think what we're talking about here is expanding choice. It's certainly not trying to limit choice.
So your definition then of expanded choice is defining what that choice should be for Canadians then. Is that true choice?
I would say that is not what we're saying at all. We're not trying to define at all what Canadians should choose to watch. What we're saying is if they choose to watch Canadian content, if they want to seek out local news and expression, if they want to listen to Canadian music, there should be a way that is available for them and discoverable. But we're not dictating to any Canadian what they should choose to watch or listen to. That will be up to them as individuals.
And it's deemed that this is necessary because there is somehow a lack of options available to Canadians currently.
I think what we're saying is that the bill that Parliament passed and gave to us said that we should find an equitable way, not necessarily an exactly equal way, but an equitable way to have both streamers and traditional broadcasters support the creation of Canadian content in the system. And that is what we're implementing following the will of Parliament.
So essentially, streamers are incredibly successful because they actually do provide great choice at a price point that is realistic to consumers. And because they are so successful, you, the CRTC, then must take a portion of that revenue and pass it off to other traditional media outlets in order to help them because they're struggling. Is that correct?
I would respectfully not agree with that interpretation because one of the things we're trying to explore is how those streamers can be involved in making content themselves, and several of them are. They're commissioning Canadian shows, they're commissioning programming in Canada, there is involvement with Canadian music. So we don't see this as an adversarial process. We see this as a process where we're trying to make sure that each part of the industry is contributing in an appropriate way, and we're consulting broadly to achieve that end.
As my Liberal colleague rightly pointed out, Spotify has seen an increase in French content by 225% in the last 5 years. This was done without Bill C-11. That seems like an increase in choice, doesn't it?
I would say that is actually something Spotify presented at their public testimony in front of us a few days ago. We were very pleased Spotify came, shared their point of view. Obviously, it's a point of view we are taking into account in our deliberations. One of the things we looked for was to hear the voices of streamers as well as people who think that streamers should be doing more in different ways. That is absolutely something they shared with us, and we'll be looking at that.
Thank you very much. I will move over to Mr. Alsoud. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and rebonjour, hello again. It's clear that we collectively share the personal goal of ensuring and incentivizing the growth of both Canadian broadcasting while also weighing the interest of consumers. You mentioned public consultations on several occasions already. What can we expect from the CRTC in terms of ensuring that both clarity and predictability are provided to both creators and platforms?
So maybe I can start with that. So that we know that is key. We know that transparency and predictability are key. We know that moving quickly is key. I would say, again, coming back to right at the outset of us being given the Online Streaming Act to implement, we immediately set out a regulatory plan to give certainty as to what would be coming up and some sense of when that would be happening. So that's one one part of it, laying out what our regulatory plan was so that people knew what to expect. And maybe just a couple of other things, and I can ask Scott to provide additional detail. One is obviously in terms of our decisions. I mean, that is a key component of that. So as we are rolling out these decisions, we are trying our very best as a quasi-judicial tribunal to make sure that they are in plain language so that, these decisions are clear. They lay out the perspectives that we've heard, the evidence that we've heard, and are very clear in terms of what the decision is. And maybe just one last thing I could mention very quickly is that we are, and it comes back to the point about engagement, we are very much engaging a lot more with interested parties, with stakeholders. We have engagement teams, which Scott mentioned, that we have set up so that to make it easier to engage with the CRTC, not just through the public proceedings, because we've heard that that doesn't work for everyone in terms of how formal it is, and we certainly heard that in Whitehorse when we had a hearing on telecom in the far north. We heard that that kind of formality is difficult to get through. So we've been engaging a lot. Scott and his team went across the country to engage with people on Canadian content. So we really are trying to do better in terms of explaining our work. I don't know if that does it. I'm happy to pass it over to Scott.
Can I add maybe just... In our hearings, we heard wildly divergent points of view. I'll make a reference to the last question we had. Spotify presenting what they do. We had radio stations coming in and disagreeing with them. So people disagreed on many, many things, which is helpful. There were two things they seemed to agree on. One was the importance of data. The other one was the importance of clear rules. Everyone asked us, when you make your decisions, please make your rules clear, because the clearer they are, the easier it will be for us to implement. And I certainly think that is something that the commissioners are taking into account in making decisions.
Thank you for that. That was excellent. Kind of in similar vein, would it be an accurate characterization, in your opinion, going back to the 280% growth that was highlighted earlier on within the Franco-Canadian space on Spotify, that the goal here is to ensure that it's not merely coincidental or luck, but that it's part of a growth strategy that our country and that our media space kind of infers? Is that an effective characterization of perhaps the intent here?
I want to be careful again about speaking about what it might mean for any specific player, including streaming services. I think, though, we always bear in mind what are our public policy objectives. And in the end, and I'll use music, we need to have a system that will create Canadian music, make it available in both languages. And we recognize that the challenges for French language music are appreciably different than the challenges for English language music, and it will need specific strategies to support French language music. And so the test for us is a little less about what will it mean for this company or that company. Obviously, we need to determine that. The success measure will be French language music will continue to be produced in Canada, it will be made available, people will discover it, and it will be enriching. That is a success. That is the challenge that is before us. And as several people have noted in their questioning, it is quite a challenge, but we're also, I believe, genuinely excited by the material we have in front of us and the decisions we can proceed to make.
Fantastic. I denote I have 30 seconds left, so I will take these last seconds to say, Mr. Shortliff, I look forward to future conversations during which we can bond on our common nerdiness about the data and the way to get there. Once again, we all truly appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. It is sincerely appreciated.
And Mr. Champoux for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais savoir, quand C11 est arrivé sur la...
I'd like to know when C11 arrived to the CRTC, there was loads of changes. There were other things you had to do exactly. Was C11 too big of a piece to chew off for the CRTC, especially since it's an urgent matter? Maybe this should have been fragmented or transferred to you in a different way. Do you have any information on this?
On a pris la loi qui a été donnée à nous.
Well, we took the bill, the act as it was transferred to us, and I think we carefully prioritized everything. We established a plan so we could have smaller public hearings. it's time or never to share this, how this happened, because there'll be other bills that'll be sent to you on AI, for example, and we are open to the suggestions as to the way that bills are transferred to you, especially important bills that generate such many presentations. Do you consider that the CRTC is, I don't want to say this in a negative fashion, but do you find you're well equipped to regulate the industry and all its changes technology-wise and all the ways we can now consume culture? Are you still well structured in order to face all these new changes, or should you try and reorganize the way the CRTC works so you can face all of these challenges? Thank you for this question. We keep changing internally. We're a quasi-judiciary tribunal. We have to follow these processes, official processes. That's our role. And we have to prioritize this, and that's what we do. We have expert teams internally on different subjects. We have 9 members that come from all over Canada with different experiences. And so, yes, I would say that we're well equipped. But on the other hand, we are also faced with different perspectives because we do all kinds of consultations. So the answer is yes. Thank you.
You for coming today and bearing testimony to the CRTC and the implementation of Bill C-11. At this point in time, I'm just going to I'm going to say goodbye to you and just pause the meeting just for one moment. We just have to do some quick committee business. It'll take 1 minute or less. So I'll just suspend just for a minute. All right, colleagues, this should take only a moment. We just need to approve a couple of funding things. So we have 2 operational budgets for 2 studies, one for $500 for a meeting on the implementation of the Online Streaming Act, today's meeting, and one for $30,500 for our upcoming study on the effects of technological advances in AI on the creative industries. Both budgets were emailed to you earlier, I believe. You should have a copy of that in your inbox. I would ask for a mover for the first budget, which is for the $500. Can I have a mover? Perfect. So Mr. Tumba. And I would look for any dissent in the room. Oh, Mr. Shampoo.
Petite question, je veux juste
I have a small question. So what we're looking at is a $500 budget for today's meeting? For is that for food expenses, or because there's no spending for witnesses? I was just wondering why we were adopting this $500 budget. Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thank you. Donc, quelqu'un s'oppose à l'adoption du budget?
The spend of $30,500 for the upcoming study with regards to AI. Mr. Shampoo. And any dissent? All agreed. Perfect. So I would just take this opportunity to remind everyone then that we have our next committee meeting on Monday, October 6th, and we will begin our study with regards to AI and its impact on the creative sector. So come prepared for that. I will not be in this chair either. I believe that your real chair will be returning. So enjoy your evening,
You
folks.
did great.
Good day.
You did great.